GM, and welcome. This is our first stream for 2025, which of course we're coining, not just us actually, industry-wide is coining this the year of Interop. So what better way to kick off the year of Interop than with the CTO of Hyperlane, Nam. Welcome back, second time on the SEDA pod. Great to have you.
Great to be here. Always love chatting to you guys.
Yeah, likewise, man. I mean, plenty to chat about as well, which we're going to be diving into. And also joining us today, we have both the co-founders of SEDA, Peter and Jasper. Look, no one here needs introductions. I guess the bull posting across Twitter has got to be your introduction for like the last month. I've seen you, Nam, going absolutely crazy on Twitter. Peter and Jasper the same, which is fantastic because the debate, if you like, around Interop or sort of the hot takes around Interop are only getting spicier. So I thought, what a better way with all the kind of predictions that are being out there for Interop in 2025 or the battle of the bridges to kick this space off with Nam. We'll go with you first. It's kind of like, what's your big predictions for 2025 in Interop? I know this is kind of like a big question and we can rip in and dive deeper as we go, but just kind of set the scene for us.
Maybe just to be spicy, I feel like a big prediction will be that it won't be as like hostile, or hostile is maybe the wrong word. Like I think as PvP, right? Like I think there's just so much surface area to cover that I think people will realize there's really like people can't do it by themselves, basically. And so I think maybe my prediction for 25 is going to be like, yeah, people recognize, hey, like I can't feasibly solve everybody's interop problem, right? Like I think really when we say that in the year of interop, I think what we recognize is that like, yeah, interop is going to be part of like many people's projects of scope and everything. And it's just going to be infeasible for like a single project, protocol, company, whatever you want to call it, to actually cover everything. And so I think you'll actually see a lot more collaboration maybe you've seen in the past where like, right, like when Interop was smaller, it was kind of felt like more like this turf war over like, no, I'm the biggest fish in the pond. No, I'm the biggest fish in the pond. And so very excited for that. I think some of that's already brewing, but I think it will become a lot more obvious this year.
I love that. I think it's interesting to maybe in my head, what that means is like Interop is going to be no longer like just Interop. It's going to be like categorized into multiple categories that need each other, right? So like verification, message passing, for example, is like two of the categories there. But I think within those, you'll see a lot of knife fighting. But I think that overall, the sort of like category of Interop is going to like, break down into smaller niches. And then those should be very collaborative with each other.
Yes. I think what I said is definitely very general, right? Like I think, or like maybe like overly generalizing, right? Like I think one of the things that I find interesting is, right, like I would say before probably OP started the superchain, I think people didn't think really like of like L2 protocols, like right, like or frameworks as like interop projects. I think that will change this year, right? And I obviously like we already see, right, like those are the biggest projects, so there's probably already some like spiciness going on between those. So I agree, Jess. So I think within these categories inside Interop, I think there's probably going to be, hopefully not knife fighting, literal knife fighting, but verbal knife fighting going on. But yeah.
There was like literal knife fighting at the last ETH Denver, remember? With the meme. I think your prediction's right. I think I kind of take a little piece from both of you. I think that 2025 we'll see maybe like a redefinition of what interop means. I think like when people thought about bridging, it's just sort of like, okay, like this asset on chain A, get this asset on chain B. I saw there was like a big debate thread between Arjun from LeFi and Tabasco from Particle about like what bridging or like what interop is, and basically, Universal X just being like a bridge interface, and just sort of like, not making like a clear cut between interop and messaging and intents, things like that. And I think that how I kind of see this is that probably my prediction for 2025 is that a lot of the infrastructure like Hyperlane, SEDA, like all these different pieces continue to kind of like go back more into the scenes and keep powering things, but that we'll see like fully new primitives launch on top. And I think that like just having like a bridge UI like swap one asset to another will probably change. I think we'll see like new sort of UX products that we haven't imagined yet that allow users to do different things with these, sort of rails. But I think that that's kind of like at the very top of, sort of innovation so far. Like it's just been like basically a Uniswap interface with 2 tokens on 2 different chains,
Yeah, my prediction would be that if you look at Interop today, it's still mostly verifying whether a token was locked on chain A or chain B, and then minting, like mint burning, right? Like essentially like asset bridging. I think 2025 is the year of arbitrary message passing. I think we'll finally see the need for verifying more complex state across chains than just whether a token was locked on chain A or chain B. And then the prediction would be that the amount of messages that do more complex computation is going to flip the just like escrow checks in 2025.
Yeah. Jess, I'm curious, like, when you make that prediction, do you think it's based on like kind of like demand finally being there, or do you predict it based on like, oh, the stack is finally easy enough to do so, or I guess both?
Ooh, that's a very good question. I think demand is the most important one, but I think the demand being there is a result of like the technology finally getting there, right? So the demand I see coming from intent protocols needing to verify cross-chain arbitrary states, because a solver doesn't necessarily just do a swap, right? There can be like more complex things, and even a swap is already more complex than just an escrow, right? So we're seeing like the intent protocols are going to like greatly increase the need of like more complex cross-chain state verification, which requires like arbitrary messaging. So that's the demand side. And then, yeah, from the technology side, I think the technology has been there for a long time, but it hasn't been very secure always necessarily. It's been or easy to use. I think that the sort of like people had a lot of creative ideas about what you can build with things like Hyperlane, but in practice, people still usually just used it for the token minting and burning, right? Even though the cool thing about Hyperlane is that you can sort of like verify any state. But that hasn't seen as much use cases yet, I feel like. And I think that this is the year in which people need it.
Yeah.
Right? And I think it's the time to shine.
I would love to see that.
What's the app on top? What's the app or the user experience on top that you see driving that, Jasper? Like, where are these really complex? Are they coming from the user, or
it's intense
in DeFi specifically?
Anything. Yeah, it's like the one interface all chain, or like one to many chain interactions that require like complex. Like also, I know this guy working on like a yield optimization app in which you can just deposit USDC, and their app spreads it across like any different chain to like yield optimize, like best lending margins, etc. If you want to do that efficiently using intent, you're just going to need to do so many cross-chain verification. You need like, I don't know, like maybe like 6 different chains where these funds will end up to have verified, right? And I mean, that is way more complex for cross-chain message passing than we've seen before. So yeah, I think we're close. Like these type of applications make sense, and they need this, and they've never been attempted before.
Do I dare ask the question, because we sort of alluded to it at the start, but like it looks like we're just going to continue to unbundle Interop, right? Like redefine Interop. There's going to be all these little segments of Interop. I'd love, as like a caveat to what you're saying, Jasper, like what does everyone see these kind of buckets? What are like the main buckets going to be? I think we're seeing now like a separation of like verification and kind of like the message passing, and then people being able to like customize their stack there. Curious to see if anyone sees any other big buckets coming out.
I mean, I would say that maybe this is a little bit controversial, but I'd say that split has been there from the very beginning, right? Like Hyperlane, Layer 0, any of the sort of like infrastructural like infra for Interop has always chosen to do the split between relayer or verify or like message passer and verification. I just think that there's new methods of verification coming up. And of course, we're excited about this because we're building some of these verification methods. But yeah, there's that category is sort of like blooming, I think, slowly. Yeah, but what is the then intent settlement and intent forwarding solver infra is another one. Nam, I need help.
I think like, so I think maybe to start with the categories first. I think verification right? I think one thing we haven't seen yet, I think, is like relayer marketplaces, right? And then message passing, right? Like those three, I think, even if like protocols like Layer 0 Hyperlane have it like modularized, theoretically speaking, I do think practically speaking, people still like purchase it as a bundle, so to speak. And like obviously, like I think like I mentioned in the beginning, like I don't think it's tenable to basically like expand to everything, which needs to be, by having like a single provider basically offer all of these. And I'm biased because I think Hyperlane, right, like is kind of like built in a way that allows other people to kind of like join in and operate. But I think those three pieces are probably like the core piece of what people have traditionally considered Hyperlane, Interop. And then I do think the two additional pieces that I would say we see probably like 24, I think, saw a lot of traction in is things like, intents, right? Like intent protocols, intent settlement. Like I think, again, previously, I would say there's a lot of them that bundled all of these four things together, actually, right? Like if you think of like across basically built their own, right, like messaging systems, kind of their own like intent settlement, right? They built their own, like in the beginning, they had to build their own like solver infrastructure, right? And now obviously solvers like have kind of like integrated across directly into their own solver infrastructure. But I think we will see the unbundling of those things. Like I think we're working with Bootnode to build kind of like open and modular kind of like intent protocol framework to allow anybody, again, to like focus on their specific parts, hoping that the like some of those things become better. But then I think on top we'll see probably like right, like more folks, honestly, like aggregators. I think it will be another kind of like piece that I would see. I expect a lot more kind of I guess competition in. And then like chain abstraction, right? Like basically building actual user experiences on top of these primitives to basically facilitate, like Jasper, like you said, like yield optimization, right? Like easier swaps. Like those are all things that I think maybe traditionally we haven't called them interop, even though we probably did call them interop. But I think there's just going to be a lot more parties at each of those, I think, modules. And then honestly, like, right, like I think what we haven't talked about is like clusters, right? Like L2 clusters.
Yes.
Like super chain, like right, like I think ZK chain, elastic chain, like obviously like the ag layer falls in that. Like I think we will see just like more of those actually going live, right? Because I think so far most people have talked about it, but I think it's like still in the early phases of that. And honestly, there's probably more, but that's kind of the things that like pop into my head right now.
I was thinking L2 clusters as well, and then I have one more to add, and that is shared sequencers. I think shared sequencers are also going to handle some of the interrupt stuff, which we haven't really seen in the wild yet. So I think that's a pretty interesting one to take a look at.
Yes. Agreed.
Yeah, I think this is a great like segue into solvers. Like I saw this debate from Tom at gas.zip and a bunch of other like chain abstraction people and Interop people jumping in, and I want to get your take on it. That like he was saying that he believes that like message-based bridges will always be more efficient than intent-based bridges because you need to have liquidity go back and forth, and we touched on this like at an earlier note, but I just want to get your sort of like take for 2025, how you see this kind of playing out, because I think one difficult area around sort of like intent-based swaps for newer chains is that you have to have like a solver come have inventory and then also like decide what tokens they want to support, right, for this inventory. I think for message-based, like if you can create like a mint and burn contract that you just deploy and have it there, anyone can come and plug their token in. And I think that's sort of like a very different approach, right, to bridging. One is modular, expansive, like looking at sort of the ecosystem as like a whole. One is sort of like, hey, we have like specific routes that we really want to serve with these specific tokens that we're going to serve them for, and it's highly competitive. And I wanted to get your take on this because I think Hyperlane's now at like over 100 chains, like 5 different VMs, like is expanding quickly, and that comes with a lot of complexity, right? That most likely can't be achieved by a lot of like intent-based networks early on. So I wanted to kind of get your take on that, what you're seeing for 2025.
Yeah, great question. I think this is one of the big things that's on my mind. I can't say that I'm like super convicted right now, but it is my belief that again, like interop won't work unless we actually figure this out. Like I think message bridges, right, like a lock and mint bridge, I think works like really well for like, right, like, hey, you have collateral on one chain and then you mint an asset on the like long tail chain, as sometimes call them. And I think I agree. Like, I think the world where we have like basically like 7-day withdrawal windows and like users will accept that is gonna be gone for sure. Like, I think we already see that. Like, I think, you know, if you're like a very big chain, like maybe like what like Sony launched, right, like yesterday, like I think you can probably attract enough liquidity to basically like smooth over those edges. But I think for most chains, it will become untenable to basically like accept that kind of withdrawal time for the users. And I think message bridges help tremendously there. And that's obviously like why Hyperlane is built in a way that like allows like long tail chains to kind of get message bridging and therefore lock and mint bridging very quickly. However, what I think message bridges by themselves don't answer is, right, like, sure, I can like get a like, right, like fast USDC or ETH bridge to my long tail chain. But like, if a user has on base, like, what do they do, right? Like, are you going to force them to go down to L1 just to go to this long tail chain? No, like that just is also untenable. And so that's where I think this kind of like, right, like messaging bridge versus intent kind of PvP doesn't really make sense to me, because like practically speaking, you need both. Like, you really need like a message bridge to basically allow somebody to basically move liquidity into the chain quickly and securely, right? And that's obviously comes with a message bridge, comes with like kind of like verification that can actually move to new chains quickly as well. But then you ultimately need intents and solvers to kind of facilitate the actual user experience, because nobody's ever going to go from L1 to the chain directly. And I think the part that I think we like a lot of the like intent discourse right now believes is like, yeah, solvers are these like beefy people that like, yeah, like need to hold inventory, and that's like super difficult. It's like expensive, right? Like, oh, like making somebody like paying like a winter mute to come to your chain is like, oh, you gotta like talk to them, like it's just like not gonna happen, and that's why it doesn't scale. Like, I believe like intent like solving will basically have to become democratized, where like anybody can run a solver. And I believe that's possible. I believe the like infrastructure burden of running a solver can go down tremendously, so that like if you are a long tail chain, like you can actually run your own solver. You start there, and like as obviously, right, like volume increases, like professional solvers, so to speak, will come join in and basically facilitate the product experience. And so yeah, again, maybe it's because I'm a pacifist or something, but like I believe like this whole PvP thing isn't necessary. We all need to work together to actually facilitate this product experience. And so yeah, I guess message bridge plus intents.
Yeah, I think like one area that I keep kind of going back to are like with message-based bridges is the fact that there's so many different versions of tokens that exist, right? So like mint and burn, you have like, I don't know, like hundreds right now, like different versions of USDC across different chains. You have like, you know, tons of different versions of ETH on different L2s and all this stuff. And I think that that's sort of like one UX thing that probably Chain Abstraction can just like solve and just pick like a default token. I do think though as well, like to kind of walk down the path of, let's say, like an L2 builder. If I built an app for, let's say, like I don't know, NFTs on Ethereum. It became successful. I want to now capture, you know, fees from transactions. So I build my own L2 using some type of like DA, like Celestia or Caldera, whatever it may be. I now need to solve interop so that users can get to my chain and away from my chain without it being like you said, like a 7-day withdrawal window. I think that what sometimes builders maybe underestimate is how difficult it is to get sort of the initial liquidity that can support that. Like as you said, like with intents having like professional solvers like a Wintermute come and market make your chain, it also sort of limits you to the top majors, right? So I think we will probably see more message-based implementations where you have like, let's say you have a token launch, you know, on this new chain. You then have to have a solver who's like willing to, you know, support users going to and from that transaction. You have to have like some way to swap that token, right? So if I launch Peter token and I want people to be able to buy it through, I don't know, LeFi, then I have to make sure there's some type of pair that's set up, right, that the market maker or solver can use. And I think that there's some intricacies that still need to be kind of figured out. And for the most part, like you said, like they work together for a lot of the major assets, but I think long tail, it's to be seen like how these sort of liquidity struggles are handled. But I think, yeah, democratizing or like creating like being a solver a commodity, it will be like a very interesting point of all of this, over the next couple of years. Like, how do we make it super easy to run a solver and super easy to like have liquidity on a bunch of chains, basically?
Yeah. Like, I think one thing I'm really, really curious for, and this is one thing that we're definitely working very hard towards too, is that, right, like if you think of like intents today, they're primarily reserved for, like you call it, like major assets on major chains, right? And on those, it's super competitive, right? Because like, yeah, like I think like for you to reasonably compete, you need to be so good at holding inventory and pricing inventory, where you basically, right, like are able to like extract like, right, like the 2 extra bips to make it actually worth your while. And I think just like there's so many chains and assets that are just left on the sidelines because all the infrastructure is geared towards those majors. And again, I think this reflects very similar to me, like, right, like Interop was like a year or 2 ago, right, where like all of message bridging was totally geared towards like the 10 chains. And if you're not one of those 10 chains, you just basically left to figure it out yourself. And so, yeah, like I very much believe in like, I think it will be very interesting to see what happens to a long tail, but like I think what we should do is see, like we should figure it out by making it accessible to people.
Yeah, fully agreed. I think also like for solvers, right? If I want to provide like ETH liquidity as a solver, I need to find a way probably to short ETH somewhere, right? To make it delta neutral. So all this liquidity I'm holding in ETH available on all these chains, like I'm hedged on that, right? And you can't do that for like Fartcoin, right? Like you need to be able to like find a place so you can like hedge it and make it delta neutral. And so I think, yeah, 100% right. Like this will probably need some more innovation. I'm curious, like we talk about expansion a lot at SEDA, and sort of it was one of our driving principles. I think for you guys as well, building this as like a modular ecosystem. For like a non-technical person, I've been getting some questions in our Discord about like how Hyperlane sort of scales to new chains. Would you be able to describe on like a high level sort of what's needed for Hyperlane to support a new chain and kind of what that looks like?
Yes, it's one of the like core design principles of Hyperlane, was basically like, how can we like, right, like pare down the message protocol, the whole stack, to basically make it simpler and simpler for somebody to get basic interop, right? And obviously there's trade-offs involved, where like, right, like the more you pare down, the less features you have, right? I think one of the things I saw like somebody tweet a couple weeks ago about like, right, like IBC is like TCP and Hyperlane is UDP, right? Because like, yeah, Hyperlane like itself does not have any kind of like acknowledgement, timeouts, right? Like kind of like higher level basically like principles to allow it to like, yeah, have certain ergonomics for developers building on top. But like what it does get in return is basic simplicity, right? And so the primary things really is like this, and this on the docs we have like an implementation guide for Hyperlane, basically that allows anybody who's kind of like developing their own implementation execution environment, for example, to basically implement Hyperlane themselves. It's pretty much 3 things. It's basically like the basic smart contracts, that's kind of the mailbox contract, probably, right, like we said, lock and mint token bridging is very standard, so probably the kind of like basic implementations of our warp ride contracts. But the interface is very simple, right? It's basically just like sending messages, receiving messages, having a particular like encoding of the message. The second thing is just like integration with our like agents, right? Primarily, for example, for the relay, because right, like developers do not want to like force their users when they send, right, like when they lock the tokens on the origin chain to then have to like themselves process the message on the destination chain. Like, it's very clear that developers and users alike do not like to deal with that, and that's what like the Hyperlane relay is for. It's fully open source, and so like the Hyperlane relay just needs to understand, how do I like index messages on an origin chain? How do I submit transactions on a destination chain? And how can I charge for that service with like the interchain gas payment system? And then you need a verification system, right? Like I think by default, if you already do that for the relay, you mostly get the Hyperlane validator out of the box, right? But for example, some like execution environments like shared sequencers, right, like already have basically like inherent trust assumptions. And so basically exposing that as an ISM allows ecosystems, new execution environments, to basically like use those to actually secure the messages. But that's obviously like, you need something to verify those messages, and obviously that's where obviously like things like SEDA also come in. But that's pretty much it, right? And I think it's very nice to see that like this kind of like open source approach really allows people to just, again, do it themselves. And obviously we're happy to help, right? Like provide review, right? Like help you kind of get to production eventually. But the idea is that like, hey, this is, right, an open specification. this is something that people should be able to implement. Actually, somewhat relatedly, like right, like one of the like takeaways I got from DEF CON was that basically I think there's a general desire for kind of like a shared specification of things, right? Because everybody seems to be like obviously like thinking like, yeah, interop is important. And so it's interesting that Hyperlane has for years been, right, like this actual open specification that people have already been implementing. But I kind of like, it never occurred to us really to like actually formally specify it as part of an ERC. And that's something that we're kind of like in the process of. I think if you look at the Each Magicians forums, you probably see the reference there. But yeah, like I think actually being able to get interop easily is, I think, one of the like key advantages of Hyperlane, and that's like hopefully something that will continue to become easier and easier.
Yeah, thank you for explaining. I think it's super helpful. I'm curious, like around sort of expansion in the new year, like in terms of the VMs that you're supporting, what does this sort of look like for the year? Are you guys talking to a bunch of new chains that are building mostly EVM? Is it mostly VMs that are like we haven't really seen that much in production? That are coming out and are newer. Sort of where's your focus? I think the beauty of Hyperlane is that anyone can deploy it, right? And if a warp contract doesn't exist for your VM, then you could rewrite it and submit for review to you guys as an example in an audit. I'm curious to see like where you guys are focusing. So I think this is like a very big debate around crypto right now, which is like, do we all focus on like just the majors or like long tail, and what constitutes a long tail, right? Is it like anything under 10 million in TVL is a long tail, or is it like 100 million or a billion? And I'm curious to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the team is gonna roast me for this, but like the goal, right, for us this year is to be everywhere, right? Like, and actually have like right now, I would say the EVM is clearly first class, and everything is like lower than first class. And I think it has to become true that in 25, like that is no longer true, right? Like I think there needs to be at least 2 other VMs that kind of like rise to the like level of support in the Hyperlane stack, similar to the EVM. And like I'd imagine like the SVM is probably the like closest up, because obviously Solana is doing very well, right? Eclipse has things done very well towards the end of last year as well. We just launched an implementation with the Soon team. There's like other SVM rollups coming up, and we ourselves, right, like are feeling kind of this like kind of the like roughness of like the EVM being kind of like special case as a first class citizen. And so it's certainly our objective to be able to expand to, I think, many more execution environments. And I don't think people will stop, right? Like obviously there's many more, happy to go into those as well. But being able to actually, right, like provide a like simple experience across all those VMs is definitely a very hard problem. I think it's a problem that like I always tell the team, like this is what has to happen for interop to work, because what cannot work is just like, oh, just interop within the EVM. And so there's a lot of like tooling, I would say, that we have right now, right? Like in our CLI, in the Explorer, when it comes to like deploying things like warp routes, that are just much easier to do on EVM, and that has to become true for other execution environments. But even for the EVM, right? I would say it's like fairly easy. Like you npm install the CLI, you deploy a warp route, you like clone like a Next.js app, and then you have like your bridge UI. Like even that has to become easier, right? Like it has to become like a single click of a button, bam, you get your lock and mint token bridge.
Do you think soon you'll have like one UI that tries to like aggregate all Hyperlane instances, like sort of like Stargate for layer 0, or like what Across is doing for their own bridge?
Yeah, I think great question. I think in some ways, like I don't think that when like Nexus, like you use Nexus.org as like a website that we started primarily to serve the TIA warp routes that were done with Celestia, but it kind of has morphed somewhat into this kind of like UI that can serve like it can serve pretty much any Hyperlane warp route, right? And so there's definitely thoughts about like, hey, like why don't we do that? I think I guess TBD on like what I would have to do. I guess honestly, maybe coming back to you, like I'm curious, like what do you think like how do you think about bridge UIs? And how do you think about what do they need to offer to kind of become useful?
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah,
Peter, go ahead.
Jasper. I was just gonna say, like, I don't know if they'll be used very soon. Like, I feel like I'll want to use bridges because, like, I'm like a power user, right? But like, I have a feeling that if an app just does like the bridging for me behind the scenes, then I won't, like, I'll go to an experience, right? Like, if you use the Universal X and you buy like some, I don't know, Pengu with like ETH, right? I'm not thinking like, oh, okay, first I have to go to like, some bridge and get like some ETH on like Solana, and then from there I can like trade it. I just say like, okay, like confirm. I don't know. I think it's a big debate, right? Like, my gut feeling is that there's still going to be like users that want to bridge manually, and have that like sort of experience. It's also like just a kind of like a risk factor, right? So like as an example, I'm still not like 100% sold as a user about putting like more than, let's say, like a small 5-figure amount in like a lot of these apps, just because like they're new, right? And with new stuff, like things can always go wrong. I'd much rather prefer having like funds in like either cold wallet or like hot wallet, depending on what chain it's on. So I feel like, yeah, bridge interfaces right now are like still kind of important for like the normal kind of like degen crypto user, but for new people coming in, like they're not going to want to know what bridging, like the bridging won't exist to them, right? Like, and that's kind of my opinion. So yeah, it's kind of like a hard question of like, should we build this as a product or not, right? Because for you guys, as an example, like having one place you can use all these warp routes is like very cool. But then maybe, you just say, okay, but in a year from now, Hyperlane won't need to have that because there's 20 interfaces that plug in for routing through Hyperlane, and that's just how users get their funds bridged, right? So there's no need for one place. So yeah, it's a tough question for sure.
I think you need it. I was in the beginning, I was in the camp of not needing it. And then as I was thinking, I think you do need it. Because I think it should be part of the selling point to people running Hyperlane is the fact that their users will be able to actually bridge funds for the routes that they're creating without having to build their own interface, right? I think that is quite important. I'm assuming there is some sort of interface people can fork or whatever for their own routes, right?
Yes, actually, the Nexus UI is based on this kind of like open source Next.js app, basically. That like it literally just runs it with like some theme and basically the configuration of like which routes. And anybody, it's like literally just like you fork the UI, you add your config, you like push it to Vercel, and then it runs. And I think the original kind of thesis was like people would prefer basically like their own product experience, right? Like if you built a new app or a new L2, like you don't want to send them to like Stargate, right? Like, that's just like a completely different app. And as a user, I'm just like, why do I have to go to this other app to come to this chain? And so I do think it's actually true that I think actually maybe both is true in that it has to be integrated into the app, and integrated into the app kind of like today just mostly means like, oh, it's like, right, like, yeah, a forkable UI, but like it probably has to actually become part of the flow. And I think Peter's is where, right, like we get back to like this kind of like intense side of things where like I don't want to have to actually manually bridge, right? I don't have to specify like the route by which I get to this L2. Like I want to just like say like I have this, I want that, it happens. And like, yeah, most bridge UIs don't actually do that for you today. Maybe they will never do it, right? And that, yeah, like things like Universal X do, but like again, like that has like limited coverage. And so I think we're always going to be in this case where like if you like develop a new app, you're smaller, like you won't have that kind of like nice experience. And so you need to have a like good day one baseline experience for your users to come to you. And that probably unfortunately does look like a bridge UI.
Yeah, that would probably just be like, ideally you have this sort of like setup where you can spin up your own warp route and then add to like some, I don't know, like warp route list for Nexus that essentially allows your chain to be added relatively easily through some GitHub PR. And then at least you have like bootstrap the ability for people to bridge over for like the first 100 users or 200 users. And then from there on, you can expand, right? I think it's especially as people
we already have that. We already have that. It's called the Hyperlane registry. It's a GitHub repo of all chain and warp route deployments, basically. And so, yeah, people basically are encouraged to kind of like add their routes to it. And then it's like on Nexus, it's literally just like a matter of like giving the warp route ID, and then it would be included in Nexus.
Well, perfect. It's there.
So yeah,
I feel
I
like
think Mhm.
I was gonna say I feel like this is kind of like Hyperlane's like the highway infrastructure, right? Where like sometimes people might opt to like take a helicopter, right, and like do something very specific. Like I want to get specifically from here to here, and I'm willing to do it in like this weird fancy way. But like you need always the default, right? Like you need to have the ability to have like basic. And Jasper, that's what you're saying as well. Like if a new chain spins up, like it might take 6 months to have like some chain abstraction protocol support it, but you can have it like instantly supported with something like Hyperlane and have that as like the rails, the bare bones are there. And in the future, that chain abstraction app will probably use Hyperlane as like one of the routes to like bridge, but just like obfuscate the experience of the user. But I think it's a good take. Like creating like baseline infrastructure, and then like you can have other things that like tap into that as well.
Yeah, I think sometimes we talk about this now, where like again, I mentioned we're working with a team called Bootnode on this intent framework, right? It's basically like think of it as like an open source like intent protocol that kind of like modularizes well enough that you can like use like Hyperlane or anything else pretty much as like settlement, right? There's like a out of the box like solver that like anybody could run. There is like a UI that people can now surface those intents for users to create. And one of the things we sometimes think about is like, right, like if you come to a user, would you allow this intent UI to basically be the primary UI, right? And actually, one of the key like concerns is like, oh, like what if like the one solver that you have for your long tail chain goes down, right? Then suddenly your way of like interacting with your chain is completely down. And so I do think actually like having right like it fall back to like the underlying bridge infrastructure as kind of like basic as it is, and as much as we don't want users to kind of be exposed to that, I think it's important to have that backup, because otherwise, right, like your liveness as an app fully depends on that one solver.
I think it always comes back to like this idea of like optionality too, right? I saw the hot takes on chain abstraction, was it last week, that Tabasco and the guys from Socket were like out, defending with their lives. But it's a good take in that when you have like chain abstraction bringing in new users, like you're saying, Peter, they don't want to know what this bridging UI is, right? They're primarily probably coming in for an app experience, and especially like in the kind of end goal vision, that app experience is probably very like consumer focused, probably like a rapid experience. They want to get in and do, and then, be involved in that experience as deep as they can. But then people that have obviously been in the space for a long time, they're much more aware of other things. Maybe it's like trust, right? And they're not willing to put anything more than four figures, into these apps. Or like the way that I see it is maybe I'm going to span this whole spectrum. I'm going to have my chain abstracted balance. I have one now on Universal X, and I use it for just like quick little flicks right now, like quick little meme plays. Just friends send me a ticker, boom, I can just get it really quick. I don't have to think about it. It's on Universal X. And then I have a few other wallets on different ecosystems, different VMs, which are just to play in those VMs. Then I have my cold storage, right? Which is just like assets that stay in there. And then I can manage my on-chain experience in a much more holistic sense. I think that's more likely what we're going to see. I think that's like mimicking what we see in like a Web 2 world as well. And people will naturally kind of come in at one point and then come down that spectrum as they learn, right?
Yeah, I guess maybe related to that, actually, because I feel like I've been talking a lot. One thing that I've noticed a few threads on over the last couple of weeks is basically like, I guess, trust assumptions, right? Like, what are the trust assumptions that like your app, your experience, like your chain relies on? And I feel like definitely what I noticed in 24 is like people don't seem to be talking a lot about bridge security. And think about like, cool, like what are the entities, what are like the things that have to go wrong for everything to be fucked? And so I'm kind of curious, obviously, as you guys are working on verification, like what is your prediction for 25, right? Like will people care more about it? Will we see basically, right, like this kind of attitude going wrong? And like, yeah, where do you see things break?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen that attitude go wrong already, right? Like, if we look at like what was it, multi-chain.xyz or something, this bridge that was hacked for like hundreds of millions, which was essentially just a multi-sig ran by a single company. I think we've already seen this. I think, I wonder if it's going to be the projects not if they start caring, or if users start caring about the bridge security, or if it's like projects just don't want to touch it, right? I think it's more so a lot of people are running these sort of like multi-sig sort of like setups because there's no other option. But if you give them the ability to sort of like deploy a contract and add it to your or point to a separate contract as one of the designers, and then you don't have to do that anymore, and it's just essentially just a relayer and like this decentralized attestation or like cosigner doing it for you, I think then it's a good selling point. So essentially, I think people won't care unless you make their life easier, right? If you can add security and make the developer experience better, I think then you're winning. But I think other way around, it's going to be quite a hard sell.
Yeah, my take is that users generally gravitate to the cheapest and sort of easiest UX, right? I think that we've seen a lot in the past, like users in crypto in the beginning, like shout about how something's like centralized, and then they just kind of forget, just keep like using it, right? And I think that's like Jasper said, like there's been, I mean, multi-chain was like one example of like 10 or 15 bridges that have like come and passed that have been hacked. And I think I don't think users really care as much as like we would hope that they would about security. I do think though that developers are caring, like Jasper said. I think like as an example with our verification product that we've been working on, to sort of plug in with the ISM and other sort of relay pieces of other bridges and intent networks. I think what we're seeing is that developers want to have this problem solved by a network that's like purpose built to execute something like this, rather than it being a multi-sig. And I think that what we're seeing right now is like Jasper said, if it's not easier, then people don't want to use it. And I think that building something that plugs into the existing infrastructure and doesn't require you to like fully rebuild your stack is something that's like very powerful. I also think that like people have started to care more, right? Like we've seen some threads recently sort of pointing out and like highlighting sort of potential like fails in security, or kind of like problem areas in security for bridges recently. I think that probably users that are bridging like I don't know, I've done it myself. Like if I bridge like $1,000 to some new chain, like I'm not like, oh, let me check the docs and make sure that this is like really secure, right? But then if like we do something with our treasury for the company, I'm like in the docs, I'm in their Discord, I'm like, hey, what about this edge case? What about this edge case? Like I'll have like a Telegram group set up, and then we're like, hey, we're bridging, right? Like so like just let you know like this is happening, right? And so I feel like it really depends on like the user and the use case, but I feel like it's on the developers, right? Like to make sure. And I think that developers care more and more because it becomes a risk profile, right? So if you're running like, let's say somebody comes and rebuilds Hyperlane, but they internalize like every aspect of it, right? Which is sort of like what we've seen with all the bridges that failed in the past, right? Like multi-chain, things like that. Like if you try to build like every single piece of the infrastructure, you usually have to cut corners because you just can't do everything, right? So like with multi-chain or other bridges, you sort of like gave away security or like complexity where you could, right? So running a multi-sig, like, okay, yeah, it's just like the company, there's only like 3 people that have this key. We all like have really good OPSEC setups, like blah, blah, blah. So this is like bulletproof for now, and we can always improve later. I think when you give developers the option to like have modularity and pick things right out of the box, then they'll do it. But up until now, it's sort of like you have to build the entire stack first. So it's kind of like Near having to build the Rainbow Bridge because Bridge didn't exist in Near, so they had to like fully build one, right? No new chain is going to be like, let's build a bridge to get liquidity. They're going to like use a stack. I will say though that like I've spoken to a few bridge teams recently, and I think there needs to be better education on like the routes and the verification that exists for that bridge, right? So I think right now there isn't like there's like the default that a lot of developers use when they set up their bridge route, but there needs to be better education on like what the default is and how it can be paired with like other verification layers or products or solutions. So I think that probably has to improve this year. But I think that generally developers that we talk to like get what we're building and they understand like why it's a net benefit not having to run it themselves.
Yep. Do you feel like the bridge teams recognize that it has to improve, or do you feel like other people like yourself or developers are you just saying like it has to improve? I'm very curious, actually, like, or like, and then maybe relatedly, the question would be like, what would you want bridge teams to do more of?
I have an interesting take.
That's a good question.
I think it's the people that care are the other people building. So app users don't care.
Mm-hmm.
They will use the default.
Yep.
But people building protocols that have native interoperability or cross-chain messaging requirements care. Right.
Yep.
So if I'm building an intent solution and I want to use yeah, of course, like Hyperlane for cross-chain messaging to settle the intents, I care that it's not a multi-sig verifying, right? Because all of a sudden, like the gun's on them if something goes wrong, right? So these are the teams that are really care about sort of like, you know, adding different layers of security to that stack in order to sort of like outsource some of the security. But the teams, yeah, I think they care. I think the best thing that they could do for their own protocol is to remove defaults and force people to pick, because that requires people to educate themselves. But that also, of course, I also definitely understand why they wouldn't do that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've had this conversation. I think I mentioned like earlier that there's some level of like desire for like standardization and specification, especially on the Ethereum side for like these messaging protocols. And one of the key parts actually is like how important are like defaults for like a message bridge basically. And I like obviously I'm very biased, but I think they're very important because I think like you said, like I think if it's not easier than something more centralized, they're always going to use the easier option, right? So it has to be just as easy as the thing that is actually like very bad, right? And so I think that's kind of why I personally think like defaults are like super important. But then I think to Peter's, like to both of your points, right? Like it has to become super easy. It has to actually become even easier, right, than just using the thing and using the default to use alternate verification options, right? And one of the things,
or like you have to make sure that your thing is so undeniable that it becomes part of the default set, right? I think that is also an option, right? Like build a product that's good enough to replace the default or to be part of the default. Otherwise, clearly you're not able to sell like your vision to these teams.
Yeah.
But even like on this note, I'll go for it.
So I was just say like I think also one problem today is like I'll take Layer 0 as an example here because I was just reading their docs like earlier today, and I think like one problem is so Google is like a verifier on the DVN, right, for messages. The problem though is that they support like 15 chains out of the box, right? So if you want to support as an application anything past that 15 chains, you're back to the default, right? So the other problem I think that we've seen today is that like, you know, most of these relay services, or people who are building it as like a product, they don't actually have the ability in a cheap and efficient way to support more than just like a small active subset. So they're like, we only care about verifying messages on like the most active routes. Everything else is kind of like outside of our purview. And so then it's always back to default because it supports like you can, you know, build it to support the route that you need. I think with SEDA, what we're seeing is that we can say, you know, hey, any route that you need, you can plug into, right? So if you have like 1,000 networks, you could have 500,000 routes between these networks, right? And you have that out of the box. And I think that this is what we're seeing is we can say to developers like, hey, if you want to support a new chain, launch a warp route there, you know, plug in SEDA for, you know, message verification, and it can be live tomorrow, right? And if you go to other relayers, I think that becomes like an issue of scale and kind of like a business problem, you know?
Now, to put it in Hyperlane terms, you call this security zones. With SEDA, if you deploy this, if you have the SEDA proof of contract on all the chains, and it's the ISM for all of these different chains, you create like this potentially giant, infinite sort of like security zone.
Yep, agreed. Right, like I think that's hopefully, you know, I'm on the good side of your view of the bridge team spectrum, but right, like part of what we're basically saying is that like, yeah, look, like we cannot build, right? Like we don't have the time to build better verification, right? Like I think this is something that we need folks like you guys to build out, right? And I think whether it's you with your SEDA zone, right? Whether that's like, right, like Superchain and Velodrome building kind of this like super chain zone and other like I think teams building their own zones. like we need that kind of like I think like development and innovation to kind of allow actual better verification to go on. And I think the part that like I think we as a message bridge need to do is we need to like encourage and make that as accessible as possible, right? And so I think the two things that I see bridge teams should be able to do, like honestly, one of my biggest like gripes, so to speak, with some of our competitors is basically be like, hey, yeah, like you can use your own verification here. And basically all they provide is like the contract interface, right? And like, yeah, sure, like anybody could implement a contract in the off-chain infrastructure to do this, but like what is actually necessary to make that like go into production, right? Where like if it's too hard to move, like sure, implement your own whatever, and then like use it on your app, nobody's ever going to do this, right? And so the things, for example, that we do is like, hey, on our CLI, right, like ISMs are basically configured as like JSON objects that you can check in as version control. And then when you want to update, right, the ISM of your warp route, you just change the like JSON config and then like you just apply it and then bam, now it uses SEDA, right? Like it has to be easier. Like you can't make your developers like use kind of like, yeah, like fiddle with verification yourself to kind of like use other zones, other like mechanisms easily. And then I think secondly, you also need, I think, a good enough abstraction that allow for like composition, right? Or allow for like, hey, like if it's a right, like actually if it's a word route message that's under $1,000, like sure, right? Like use the default. But if you want to transfer $1 million, no, like then you actually want to do like aggregation, right? And so I think having these kind of abilities to compose verification mechanisms, depending on message content, depending on like the circumstances, rate limits, and so on, right? Like I think any, like all of our competitors, like right, like anybody can implement smart contract logic to accomplish this. But I think the question like is going to become who's going to make that easier. And I guess my personal wish for 25 is that I think more people recognize that like yes, like this is important, and like yes, like it's on the bridge teams to make that more accessible, so that like all I have to do is say like yes, I want more security, click button, bam, I'm done, right? Like it shouldn't be like right now. I do think even with most bridge protocols, most messaging protocols, if you want to have more security, you have to dedicate like an engineering team working on this for months, even if you have things like verification mechanisms out of the box. So that I think has just become better, because otherwise, right, like I think it's honestly been a bit too long since there's been a bridge hack, and it's maybe like a wild statement to say on the like year of the Interop stream. But like I think people have like lost their memory of like multi-chain and like things like that, right? Because I think it was like 23, to be honest. And I don't think we should like tempt fate, right? Like I think we should like I wish there was maybe somebody who like looked at you know, like message bridges and like how much better they have gone with respect to like security and verification. And like just even if there's nothing going wrong, like I think we should hold ourselves to that standard.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. I think like one thing that we've been trying to do, and we actually have like an announcement, so I won't spoil too much coming out at the end of this month, but like creating a market, a new market for verification is very important. And I think like making this a more pronounced piece of the stack so that developers understand like this piece of the sort of modular puzzle that they're putting together. And I think that with SEDA, what we've been doing is just like making sure that bridge teams know that we're an option, but also like developers building applications on top, like know, hey, you can add this as a route. And I think that like Jasper said, teams that are building like very specific intent execution, like things like that, they're already super excited because they're like, I won't dox too, because I think they're not super public with what they're building yet, but there's one existing bridge team that's building like a new product. And, they said like, hey, like we don't have the ability to make it custom enough with these other products to be able to support what we need, right? So we talked to all the other, sort of like relay projects, and they have kind of an out of the box solution. I think where developers have really like what we're building is they say like, we can build a fully custom program that does exactly what we need it to do and calls exactly what data sources, all these things that we want it to. And we can put that into like one sort of area and call that. And I think that this is sort of like this big innovation where you have like programmable security and verification, where other layers are kind of like, hey, here's a default out of the box. It might plug in or it might not,
Yep. Yeah, I mean, I guess maybe to again ask you more pointedly, like what would you want us to do, like as an Hyperlane? Like what would you want, like, right? Like I think I heard a little bit like, hey, you want it to be like more clear this is a marketplace, right? Like there should be a page on the docs that like show like what options you have, right? Like I was just talking with like Giorgio's from Hashi, and right, like maybe similarly there, right? Like it's kind of like, I think it's like it's clearly possible, right? And like there's an integration, but maybe it's not like as prominent. Like what feedback would you have basically for bridge teams like Hyperlane to kind of like make that better?
Yeah, I think from my side, and Jasper, feel free to give your input as well as a developer. I think that highlighting it, like you said in the docs, is like a good place to start, right? I think that like the relay piece of the stack hasn't really been super clear for most bridge teams. It's kind of like a piece that's under the hood. So I think making sure that there's enough education around like what the relay does, because it is like a super important piece of the stack, right? If a multi-sig is compromised, or like a default relay is compromised, they have the ability to pass messages that are verified, to contracts, so they could do an infinite mint attack or whatever it may be. So I think highlighting the risks is important. Like, hey, like this is why it's important that you pick like a subset of relayers, and here's what they have sort of control over in your product. I think that's probably the most important pieces. I think, and I think you guys with Hyperlane do a good job at that already. Like I think you guys do a good job highlighting exactly like, hey, this is what the relay does in our stack, and here's how it like interacts with our warp routes. But I think that that's probably the piece that needs more education for developers when they deploy this. Like, hey, what does this have control over?
Yep.
To me, it will be like probably like with SEDA, hopefully the fact that you through one Hyperlane integration can plug into sort of like any warp route or route within sort of like other SEDA enabled chains, like this, the security zone aspect of it should be, I think, a strong selling point. And so highlighting the selling points of these things, right? Like I think if you just say, hey, you want to be more secure, use this, I think people will be like kind of reading over that. I also don't know if the scare tactics work, but I think the basically like sell people on the pros of using sort of like these more permissionless, at least integration.
Cool. Yeah, appreciate the feedback. One thing maybe I will make a request to you guys actually is because honestly it's been a while since I've thought about like I guess non-default verification mechanisms, but in our CLI there's like this interactive, like we call it, like I think ISM config command, basically where people can specify, hey, like this is the ISM configuration that I want, right? And it would be lovely, right? Like if basically in that CLI itself you can literally just say like SEDA, right? And then it like basically spits out that JSON config. And then like now anybody with that JSON config can like apply that to their warp route and instantly gets like SEDA verification, right?
We'll PR it.
And so right, like this is, again, to me it's like, right, like it's one thing to talk about like, hey, we have modular verification, right? Like at this point it's table stakes, but to be honest, like actually making it accessible is like a hard part, right? Like making it accessible to developers who are like, I don't want to like, lazy is the wrong word, but like, right, like they don't want to think, like they don't want to spend weeks thinking about this, right? They want it to be like an easy option. And to me, like, I mean, maybe like this is engineer brain minded too much, but like just like engineering is the way to do that, right? Like making it accessible, building tooling, having it being open source, right? Like not you needing to like, oh, like, can we please be part of a canonical tool chain? Like, hey, this is open source. You make a PR. Now SEDA is an option in the CLI that everybody uses to specify like security modules. That would be lovely.
100% sounds great.
I love a good pod that feels like a BD call. That's exactly what you want. I want to add a little marketing.
Right? Like we have to, like, if we want the 25 to be the Interop, like we just have to make things accessible. Like that's honestly like, I don't know, this is my complaint about like 23 and 24, but sometimes we like, I think this is going to be where we actually built Interop, because like sometimes people just like love talking about Interop, but like it's not going to happen unless we actually like make it easy to use for developers and therefore users.
And the worst case scenario is like, I remember, I think it was like the wormhole hack, or maybe it was a different one. Like it set users back. Like people were like afraid, and I remember like all these threads on Crypto Twitter being like, don't take your assets off like ETH, right? Like don't mix them, and if you have to, like go via centralized exchange. And we don't want users, because of like us not sort of caring enough on the Interop side, like you said, like putting in the work to get it to a place where it's sort of safe with first principle design. Then we could have like users be like, okay, I don't want to use bridges anymore because I lost money, right? And I think, like you said, like we haven't had a bridge hack in a long time. I think users just kind of take bridges for granted, and they're just like very commonplace now. And in your mind, they're probably the same as just like doing a swap on Uniswap. Like it just works, and your tokens arrive back in your wallet, and it's all good, right? But yeah, it's up to us to make sure that stays that way and continues improving. And from our side, we are getting ready to launch like a final version of our DevNet 5, and then audit coming up next month. And so yeah, we're getting to a place where we're super close to being able to launch this to mainnet. And so yeah, very excited for 2025.
Love it. You have SEDA.
Year of SEDA, year of Interop. The one thing I want to add on that though is like, just the marketing angle, being the only marketing guy on the call here, is like the wider story here is that we write about decentralization quite a lot, right? We talk about it in my marketing team a lot. And Ben, one of the guys in the team, he's got this really big passion for like this concept of, secured by Norton, which was like one of the old security firms back in the day. And no one cared about that for a long time, right? People using the product maybe cared about it in the beginning circles. But as, Norton expanded, or these softwares expanded, it became this sort of like subconscious thing for the consumer who didn't need to know anything about it, but they just learned to trust it. And I think in Web3, we need to start to distance ourselves from like this scam industry, like this poor reputation that we have with like that's stopping a lot of normies coming in and really experiencing it. And then also starting to separate projects that care about this, like security, that really care about security, and then the projects that are just here for a quick flip and they come and go, right? And as we grow as an industry, these things like having, whether it's, secured by SEDA or just like developers being able to have more education around security, put that into their products, and then educate their users of why it will eventually become a selling point, is my point again. It will eventually become like a subconscious icing on the cake selling point. Yeah. And I think industry needs to move towards that.
Well, it becomes a selling point as soon as you're selling to, I don't know, like Safe, or if you're selling to Circle, right? They would never use something that doesn't prioritize security more or similarly to them prioritizing their own security, right? So it sort of like depends on who you're talking to as well, that you'll be sort of like forced, if you want to win, to really care about it. If you want to have sort of like the industry titans in your corner, right? So I think naturally we'll get there.
Yeah, and I think sorry, Tom, go ahead.
I'll go for it.
I was just gonna say, like, I think your approach with Hyperlane is the best approach because you have the ability to be modular, right? So like SEDA is going to emerge. There might be like 4 or 5 other companies that are built that compete with SEDA, right, in this verification landscape, and why not use them all, right? I think that like having the ability to be modular creates sort of the best practice for safety, and I think that it's a great sort of like first principle on design that is important to have, right? Because I think the products of like 2018, 2019 through like 2022 were just kind of like, here's our stack, take it or leave it, right? And I think that now like we have just like, plug and play, like really like Legos, like, DeFi in 2018, it was like, plug a Lego in and have like different protocols to be able to interoperate. But now I think like it's really like Legos, like interoperability is, have all these different stacks that you can like plug into basically. So I think it's really important.
Yeah, I think on that, I like, honestly, I want, I think me, but also everybody in this industry to take your feedback actually very seriously, which is like, it's not just that like modularity matters, but like practical modularity matters, right? Like modularity doesn't matter if like it's not easy enough to use, like to allow folks like you to like actually be used by developers. And I think that's like super important. And actually, I wonder, one thing that we didn't mention is part of like the primitives or like the things that now fall under Interop. Like honestly, like I think users will care once insurance is available, right? Like once insurance is available and actually prices like, oh yeah, like if you use the default, it will cost you this much in insurance. Oh, if you use SEDA, it will cost you this much in insurance. And then it will become much more obvious to developers and users like, oh yeah, like obviously I want to pay less in insurance.
That's hilarious,
like,
actually.
Let me do that, right? And I think maybe I'm thinking of insurance because obviously like, like shit's pretty fucked right now in California. And like, yeah, like just like, reading a bit about like the insurance market, right? Like, honestly, like in a world before we had insurance, you were like totally screwed, right? Like if your house burned down, and like we recognize, like what we should do is we should let like professional people actually assess the risk and then like sell insurance, and like that's like a net benefit to society. And like we probably should think of like Interop the same way, right? Where like Interop is going to be so critical for our industry. But yeah, like we kind of recognize that like a lot of people are not able practically to reason about it, but like I think by actually like pricing this risk, maybe that's kind of like the way that I don't know. Like 25 seems a bit ambitious to have like price bridge risk everywhere, but that certainly should be our goal.
Yeah, that's really cool. How I mean, I don't even want to think about building that insurance. Like however that should work. That sounds like a nightmare.
I have
although very cool.
I have this feeling that like we have some posts on that, happy to share afterwards as well. But like I actually don't think it's that hard. Like I mean, obviously, like what's gonna be hard is like I guess like I think the mechanism will be obvious. Like I think right, like being able to basically like associate like economic security with like failures of verification. I think that will be like become. I do think that will become like viable in 25. Like we will work towards that for sure, and we'll have that live in 25. But yeah, I think actually like making it like super easy accessible so that like like in LeFi you can basically see like, oh, like this is like the insurance options. Like that probably will take longer in 25.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure we actually like talked to John about like insurance pricing risk when we were in San Francisco, Jasper, like 6 years ago now, when we were building like the derivatives for startups. I think it's a really interesting take. Like, I think you're 100% right. Like, it is pricing risk, right? Where like, I think today risk in DeFi is priced as like, okay, this protocol secures XYZ billion, so if it's hacked, that's what's at risk, right? But I think it's like conceptualizing that and showing it to people who are building different pieces of the stack, like we'll probably enforce that. But yeah, I think it's I think like there was a thread, I forget who it was by, but they were talking about like security risk of UMA versus like a DVN on layer 0. And you know, they're saying like, okay, with UMA there's like what was it, Tom?
Yep, I think so.
Yeah. And you know, basically like you just have to corrupt like, you know, a large whale or whatever. And I mean, I'm not going to comment on the feasibility, right, of like the thread. Like nothing in it for me to take a side on that thread, but I think in general, like people are starting to think about the risk of like, you know, hey, how can you, you know, break a multi-sig, right? Like who could you target in real life, or who could you bribe, or whatever it may be. And I think, you know, we will start to see more sort of use cases of this where we say, okay, like what could break this system? If you like want to get access to Google, do you have to like get the CEO on the line and like, you know, attack him in some way, or do you just have to like compromise the security engineer, and like what route do you have to take, right? And I think
I wonder if I think it was Tom from Gas that like I think posed that question of like, oh, like right, like actually like how hard would it be to compromise UMA and therefore a cross. And then I did find it interesting. Was like, well, like right, like it's very hard to like stealing the key is harder. And no, like I think it's obviously like a reasonable debate to be had. Is like right, like it's easier to like do an economic attack versus like stealing a key from like a relatively professional organization. And like honestly, like put the money where the mouth is at, right? Like just like either make a prediction market and be like, okay, like what's gonna happen first, or like or like risk, like price the risk in insurance. And I certainly know where I would put my money on, but I think it would be very interesting to allow people to actually put money where their mouth is.
Yeah, it's just that I would need certainty that one of the two is going to happen within a certain time frame for me to park money there, right?
Fair enough.
That's the only thing where maybe they're both so practically unlikely, right? That it won't happen. But I mean, historically, if you look at bridge hacks, we have seen one and not necessarily the other. So
yes, that I agree, right? Like I think I spent most of my time thinking about like key custody risk, right? Like yes, like I think like we've been able. I think there's definitely been better practices over time, right? For like key custody, but like if I'm thinking of like in like unwrapped, or like if I'm thinking about the ETH security Telegram channel, right? Like what happens the most? It is key extraction. And so I definitely wouldn't say like, just because there's a professional entity that like key extraction is basically like unrisky. Like I think North Korea very resourceful. I'm scared shitless of them.
Yeah, definitely agree. Yeah, I think like that's one other piece of SEDA that I like having the network provide security, like the proof of stake network, rather than having just like a company do it. I think having like 100 like professional validators, basically like running a chain is much more risk averse than having like 10 people or 5 people or like one management at some org do it. But yeah, no, really appreciate the time. I think there's some really cool predictions for 2025. Also, like a lot of really awesome takes. So really appreciate you joining us again. And yeah, we'll get working on our PR for this push for DevNet. And yeah, very, very excited to be working on some stuff with the verification with you guys. And very bullish on 2025 for Hyperlane. I think you guys are going to have a super stellar year as well. So super excited.
Yeah, love for you, Interop. We need things like SEDA for really it to come to a fruition. And yeah, like always happy to chat. Super enjoyable. And like, let's see, I guess, how our predictions go this year.
Yeah, exactly. We'll have to do an end of the year space to see if we were right.
Yeah.
Cool, sounds good. Have a great morning.
Yeah, we'll loop back for another space with you guys as we go to launch this program live and have a look at it in the wild. But if you want to come and talk chain abstraction to everyone tuning in, we'll be here on Thursday with Socket discussing solver scalability. Man, that was an amazing chat. Jasper, Peter, thank you all for your time. We'll catch up again soon, no doubt. 2025, the year of Interop.
Cool.
Have a good one.
Cool.
Thank you, Nam.
Sounds good.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.